Good afternoon, everyone again. My name is Ettore Greco. I am the Executive Vice President of the International Affairs Institute and the head of its program on multilateralism and global government. And I'm very pleased to open this meeting on the role of G7 in promoting North-South cooperation. This meeting is part of a project that we have conducted for 1 year now and which has been recently renewed. The project is centered on Italy's development cooperation in the wider context of international efforts and policies of international organizations and such forums as the G7 to support sustainable growth, the green transition, and the mitigation of climate changes in developing countries. And let me stress that we have carried out this project in partnership and with the support of two well-known foundations, Focus 2030, whose institutional mission is to promote international development on the global agenda to assure that this subject is on the top of this agenda in close cooperation with the actors of the development community, and the foundation Compagnia di San Paolo, which is, as you probably know, a long-lasting partner of our institute. The project has included so far several types of activities, public events, closed-door workshop, a public opinion survey, background reports, and research papers. The overall goal of the project is to raise awareness and also promote national debate on the role of development cooperation in Italy's foreign policy, more broadly, Italy's external action, discussing possible ways and means that Italy can use to keep its international commitments regarding official development aid. Our effort throughout the development of this project has been to involve and also closely interact with the national civil society organization, which are working towards the same goal. Organizations that have done this for many years in many cases, and possibly also provide a bridge between them and Italian decision makers. In this meeting, particularly in the second session, we want to discuss the prospect of international cooperation and development by focusing on the role of the G7, looking into the initiatives undertaken or promoted so far by the G7 and its future plans. Of course, it goes without saying that this also requires discussing the political and strategic problems that in the current very challenging international environment, the international development agenda faces, including the deepening antagonism with China and Russia, and the growing difficulties in the dialogue with the so-called Global South. This is perhaps a controversial phrase, Global South, perhaps, but is, in our view, still a meaningful one, at least in the current international debate. This is why we have decided to include in our title. Perhaps it can become obsolete in the future, but I think it is at the moment significant of the difficulty we are meeting in dialogue with developing countries that have, of course, structural problems with which we need to deal. And indeed, the document approved at the G7 Hiroshima summit places a great emphasis on the dialogue and cooperation with the Global South as a key component of the group's global agenda, an aspect that the G7 program is in the G7 program has an important strategic role also for the security and stability of the international system, which in fact we know depends heavily on that of developing countries and the capacity to address such structural problems as the high level of indebtedness of those countries. So I believe it's important to discuss what the G7 can do concretely to advance cooperation with developing countries, by in particular providing a political impulse to the action of international organizations with specific mandates regarding development cooperation, including international, regional, and national development banks. One of the central topics of our discussion in the second session will be, in particular, the very complex questions of financial resources, instruments, and procedures to promote the global agenda makes it possible that it make real progress. So it will be, of course, also of interest to discuss the prospect of the upcoming summit for a new global financial pact organized by France, which will take place in a few days. So I also wish to express our deepest thanks to the experts who have accepted our invitation to serve as panelists today. They will offer having different specialization, representing different type of organization. They offer different perspective, and this I think will contribute to enriching the debate. In the first session of today's meeting, we would like to discuss the role of the G7 from a quite wider perspective in view of the Italian presidency of the group next year. And we have the great pleasure and honor to have with us Ambassador Luca Ferrari, G7 G20 Sherpa at the Prime Ministerial Office, who will have a conversation with our President Ferdinando Nelli Feroci on the results of the Hiroshima Summit, the future challenges of this G7 and its relationship with the G20. And we will perhaps get also some preliminary insights on the agenda of the Italian presidency. So many thanks, Ambassador, for being with us today. This fifth session is meant to set the stage in a way for the subsequent discussion in the second one, but also to help us understand how the Italian presidency can ensure the right mix of continuity and innovation in the G7 work. We know that this is a fundamental challenges of all presidency. So thank you again, all of you, for being with us today, for taking part in this meeting. I'm sure it will be an interesting and inspiring debate. So Ferdinando, over to you.
Thank you, Ettore, and welcome everybody to this meeting today. First of all, I'd like to welcome once more Ambassador Luca Ferrari as a special guest of this afternoon seminar. As I was saying, he's probably in the best of all possible positions to assess the prospects of future G7 meetings, but also to give us some judgment on what happened in Hiroshima. A few words on Ambassador Ferrari. Before being appointed as Sherpa of the Prime Minister for G20 and G7, he has been ambassador in Beijing, and before that he was ambassador in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. So an experienced and skillful diplomat with a very special responsibility as the highest ranking Italian official in charge of coordinating the participation of the government of Italy to both G20 and G7. Of course, the interest today will be focused in particular on the role of the next incoming presidency of the G7. And I would start with asking Ambassador Ferrari his own evaluation of the results in Hiroshima. We have read a lot of positive judgments. I would like to hear from him what, in his views, in his assessment, in the assessment of the Italian government, have been the main messages, the most relevant messages which have emerged from this summit held in Hiroshima. Luca, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ferdinando. Allow me first of all to thank Ettore Greco and Ferdinando Nelli Feroci for inviting me to talk with all of you today. It's a real pleasure to be here at the Institute for International Affairs in Rome. And it's an honor to talk about the G7 and the G20 with all of you, and especially with Ferdinando, who has been a long-time friend and one of my ambassadors during my many roles at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We miss him very much at Farnesina. But having said that, the G7 in Hiroshima was definitely a success in restating what the G7 has become in these past years. I believe the conflict in Europe has changed issues and perceptions, and that we like it or not, that's how things are going. And the G7 is more and more becoming the control tower of the liberal democracies. It was born to be the assembly of the richest nations in the world. Of those, only one has remained the richest nation in the world. But it has become the control tower of liberal democracies, especially in time of war. And as such, it does guide where liberal democracies want to go. So we faced in Hiroshima different problems. Some came from the past, the Ukraine issue, the Ukraine crisis, the war of aggression of Russia on Ukraine, how we can cope with it, how we can face it. And I think the fact that President Zelensky was able to participate in the G7 itself was a measure of the success of the capacity of the G7 to affirm its steadfastness together with Ukraine and its decision to soldier on in this terrible and useless conflict. The second thing, this G7 was held in Asia. So it's an Asian-centric G7, there's no doubt about that. And it coped with the issues of Asia, and in particular of the host country. It was by no chance that we were in Hiroshima, not only because it was the hometown of Prime Minister Kishida, but also because that's where one of the two places where we have dropped atomic bombs during conflicts. So the meaning of the summit, which I think we were able to pass on quite clearly, was no more war, we want peace, no to atomic bombs. And I think this was quite clear. This is a point on which liberal democracies want to stand, on which the G7 want to stand, and on which, with the outreach countries that joined us on the last 2 days, we had a very, very strong measure of sympathy and understanding. And I would say that all the countries present in Hiroshima on the last day were in agreement on the basic issue of the atomic threat. The third point was the new actor in town. We live in an era of the rise of the others, and among the others, China has risen more than others, and it has become possibly the second world power. So we didn't discuss China specifically. We did discuss China, but it wasn't all about China. It was a lot about economic security. It was about economic autonomy. It was about economic strategy. So we we woke up when Russia invaded Ukraine to the fact that Europe was tied to Russian energy and that we had the urgent need to diversify. And we now are talking to ourselves, among ourselves, on how we are tied to other supply chains, many of which go back to China. Now, this is not an issue of being against China at all. On the contrary, we are very open to have economic exchanges with China, to have political relationship, to solve world crises together, to have a very peaceful coexistence with China. But if, especially Europe, but if we want to regain a certain degree of autonomy, a certain degree of independence, we have to regain some of our supply chains. So one of the arguments of conversation was economic security and economic coercion, how to regain our economic autonomy and independence in certain fields, in certain strategic supply chains, and still maintain a globalized economy. And then we went on to speak about free trade and globalization. So globalization, of course, and free trade, of course, are necessary, but as Prime Minister Meloni pointed out very clearly, we thought that globalization would be a panacea that would solve all our problems. That hasn't been the case. We've had new problems, new issues, and so we have to face and we have to correct globalization and face its dire consequences and make them better. In all of this, one of the main issues that we discussed and that we cared about was the relationship with what we commonly call the Global South, the middle countries. When I was younger, they were called the non-aligned members of the UN. They have many names, but the rest of the world, especially the southern part of the rest of the world, and I'm thinking of South America, Southeastern Asia, and Africa. So we have to reach out to these countries. We have to understand their issues and we have to help them to grow in a possibly better way. We have a duty as richer countries to help the poorer countries, the developing countries, but even the emerging markets, the ever emerging countries, to have a prosperous future. Something like we have to give it to them. And so there was a lot of debate on the main issues which touch our relationship with the Global South, which is food security, climate change, environment, energy, and as you probably have noticed in the final communiqué, there were many chapters on this. So these were, grosso modo, the themes that we touched upon on the G7 and on which we are working. We introduced the issue of migration, the right of people to live in their own countries and not to be obliged to migrate. That is one of the issues we want. And how to put an end to human trafficking, which is a new form of modern slavery. We touched upon the issue of artificial intelligence, how it affects the economy, and how we could work to reduce the negative effects of the entry of artificial intelligence into our lives and take out only the benefits. We have to think about these issues. We cannot just brush them aside and let private companies work on them. And we discussed also about demography and birth rates and on how we can stimulate these issues and how we can touch upon them, how we can work on them to make them positive, to give a positive spin. Thank you.
Thank you, Luca. I must confess that I find myself in a rather difficult situation because of your very comprehensive presentation. You've been wonderful in synthesizing in a few minutes a communique of something like 36 pages, picking up the most important issue that has been discussed in Hiroshima, and also anticipating some of the questions that I was going to address to you in a moment. But I'd like to ask you something more precise, more detailed. In particular, I know, I'm very well aware that each and every presidency has its own agenda, has its own priorities, and then often the agendas are dictated by events that are not predictable with a year of advance. But my curiosity would be the following. How much do you see in terms of a possible legacy from the G7 and the Japanese presidency to the next incoming G7 under the Italian presidency? How much, if possible, I know it's very early, how much you see of possible continuity versus how much of this continuity can you anticipate at this stage of the preparation of the summit? Again, I know that it's not an easy exercise, but I wanted to provoke you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ferdinando. Well, one thing I discovered, because I'm totally new in this game, as you said before, I've been working more on bilateral issues. One of the things I discovered when I joined the Club of the Sherpas is that there's a sort of very fair continuity between one presidency and the other. So the Japanese were very careful not to undermine in any possible way the conclusions reached in Elmau. So one of the things we have to do when we will host our summit in Italy is not to undermine the legacy of the Japanese presidency. Some of the main issues will be there. I hope Ukraine will not be there. But unfortunately, as I see the situation today, I believe that the Ukraine crisis, the Ukraine conflict will still be there. Maybe we will be in a reconstruction mode, who knows? Let's hope for it, let's cross our fingers. Secondly, economic security, I think we will still be there. It will take, if we want to reach our goals in economic security, will take maybe more than 10 years. So economic security and the issue of economic coercion will still be there. Certainly, the discussions on food security, climate, environment, and energy will be there as well. There's no way we will have maybe clearer ideas, but there's no way that on this kind of issues we will, sort of brush them aside and not discuss them. Maybe some will be on top of the list and others will have gone down. We'll see that as the months progress. I think one issue that we as presidency want to bring in, but we have found that the other presidencies are in agreement, is the issue of migration, as I told you. We certainly want to discuss migration and our relationship with Africa. There are two, as the Prime Minister always says, we must not have a predatory approach to Africa. I would add that we must not have a predicatory approach to Africa. We need to support and sustain the development without being paternalizing in our action. And that's sometimes a difficult game. So this will be certainly on the agenda, and then we'll see what other items might come in. No nuclear proliferation will be there. Gender issues will certainly be there still. I think many of the issues that we touched in this presidency will again be there.
Once more, you have already anticipated the answers to the following questions that I had in mind, which was exactly those suggestions that you elaborated a moment ago. And my question would be, are you already thinking at something as an argument, a series of topics that would characterize the Italian presidency of G7 next year? In a sense, you have already given an answer. I've got an indication about migration. I've got an indication about the relations with Africa. By the way, Prime Minister Meloni, if I'm not wrong, anticipated the idea of an invitation to be addressed to the African Union as such. So I'm very well aware that it's far too early for you to be able to give us some more indication, but I think that there is enormous interest in the audience, those that are present here, those that are following us from remote, to know a little more. If you have something beyond what you said already, and I've got these two messages in particular, on what particular items in the agenda become the characterizing elements of the G7 under the Italian presidency. And I would be more precise later on with something on the problem of relation with the global south, but at least I would come to this later on.
I think, Ferdinando, that what will characterize the Italian presidency, because it's a Mediterranean presidency, is the relationship of the G7, of the richer nations, with the global south. And that is the main reason why I'm here today, because this is a conference on the global south, on how to reach out to the global south. And I think that as a Mediterranean presidency, that will be possibly, from any presidency point of view, one of the main agenda, one of the main things that we will put on the cooking shelf. The relationship with the global south entails many issues. I would see three principal ones: climate, energy, and one which is sort of a consequence of the other two, which is migration. It can be an independent item, it can be something that comes from the first, because there's a climate migration, for example. Or we can help countries to create better living conditions through energy. So this will certainly be one of the main items on the shelf of the Italian presidency. We have to see what surprises the geopolitical and geoeconomic situation in the world will hand to us, what cards we will be handed. We will find that out possibly at the beginning of next year. There might be something new on the agenda that we cannot foresee today. We weren't expecting a civil war in Sudan so fast. We were worried about the situation, but not expecting a civil war, which is going on. So issues can come out. And let's hope that we don't have too much on the agenda. As I said before, I believe we will still have Ukraine. The conflict in Ukraine is unfortunately not about to go away very quickly. We always hope we make our strongest diplomatic efforts, our strongest peace efforts, but there is no magic solution. And this has to be understood. There's a proliferation of initiatives, Chinese mediator, a South African proposal, Brazil is having some proposals. The truth is, there is no magic wand to solve such a conflict. It's a conflict, a clear conflict of aggression. It's a clear violation of the UN Charter. And one side, Russia, has to take decision upon itself to step back on its to come back to reality, to come back to the true world, to come back to the international community. But as we said, we will support Ukraine as long as it takes, and whatever it takes. So Ukraine will be there. Economic security, again, will certainly be there, because there is a very strong debate in Europe and in the United States and in many other places in the world about regaining control of its proper economy, of the necessity to somehow correct globalization, which has brought us, I don't know, if you build a car, one piece comes from China, one piece comes from Brazil, one piece comes from Germany, one from Italy. At the end of the day, if you have a crisis in one of the 3-4 continents, you can't get pieces of the car. We have to correct this. We have to somehow put back together, but especially our strategic supply chains, the one on strategic minerals, rare earths, and so on, where we need to have some level of autonomy, of independence from the rest of the world. I think Europe especially needs to regain its own capacity to do things.
Yeah, thank you. G7 is one format of forum which was created back, if I remember correctly, in 1975. Then became G8, and it became again G7 again for reasons that we know. In 2008, another forum similar in the way it's functioning was created, to deal with a very specific problem, which was the economic and financial crisis of those years. I have in mind the G20. G20 has been rather effective at the beginning, in the very first years of the crisis. It has provided probably the only, if not the best, forum for macroeconomic policy coordination in a very critical phase of the economic situation worldwide. Then its relevance, I wouldn't say has been reduced, but certainly it has not been as relevant as it has been at the beginning. Nevertheless, G20 is there. In a sense, it is more representative in terms of number of participants than G7. And I think, at least in my opinion, is that there is an interest in trying to coordinate the agendas, seeing whether there is a possibility of realizing synergies or some sort of interrelationship between the two fora. Are you working with this idea in mind? Is there something already that you can anticipate on how and on which particular subject a coordination of agendas could be envisaged between G7 and G20 during the Italian presidency?
Thank you, Ferdinando. I think that's a very important question. So the G20 has become a very important fora, especially now that it's very difficult to discuss at the UN level. The fact that we can discuss among countries within a G20 format is very important. And it's slowly acquiring a political standing, although it was born as a mainly economic forum of dialogue. Now it's becoming more and more political as well. We have a very important presidency this year, the Indian presidency. Next year will be Brazil, and the year after will be South Africa. So it will be 3 of the BRICS countries. So they will certainly characterize the G20 very strongly, or will try to do so. And I think it's good. I think it's very important to discuss issues around the table of the G20 with the international organizations, invited countries and reach out countries, under presidencies of emerging countries like India, like Brazil, like South Africa. I think that is the real outreach towards the global South. So the G7 look at the G20 with enormous interest, with great respect, and with a strong will to collaborate and to do our best for the G20 to work well and to be a success. In Japan, the G20 current presidency and the incoming presidency were invited, Japan and Brazil. We have a very strong relationship with all the countries belonging to the G20. Some are other liberal democracies, so it's not just the West and the rest. It's a mixed group of countries. The agenda items that the G20 discuss are in many fields the same that we discuss at G7 level, because they are global items that you cannot just ignore. We discuss climate change in the G20. In the COP28, we will discuss it in the Emirates at the end of the year. We discussed it in Egypt last year, and we discuss climate issues among the G7. The same goes with energy, the same goes with food security, the same goes with global health, and so on. So there are many items on the G20 agenda that are also on the G7 agenda, and vice versa, of course. We try to coordinate within the G20 position of the G7. We're not always successful. Sometimes we have different positions on certain items, but certainly there's a very strong relationship between the G20 and the G7, and I think the agenda of the G20 will be strongly present in the agenda of the Italian presidency of the G7.
Thank you, Luca. I have a more tricky question, if I may. You're certainly aware that G7 has been criticized and is criticized as being, as you said at the beginning, a club of rich countries, much less relevant than it used to be when the club was created. I was looking at some statistics. I mean, in terms of if you compare the situation in 1990 to the situation today in terms of participation to global GDP from 60% to 43%, in terms of participation to global international trade from 52% to 27%, in terms of global CO2 emissions from 40, this is good, from 41% to 22%, and in terms of global population from 12% to 10%. The reduction is not that dramatic in terms of population. They're rather strange data. I am a little surprised, but this I cannot contest the figures that I have received. So my question is, how would you respond to those criticisms? How would you, that mainly focus on the fact that G7 is not as representative as it was in the past, or it should be a forum that would pretend, in a sense, to provide an input, decisive input to global governance. In your first presentation, you mentioned the fact that there are values that connect together the countries of the G7, which is probably not the case for the rest of the other fora. So, but what would be your reaction to this sort of criticism?
Well, you have to see the G7 in the historical context. So when the G7 was born in 1975 and its evolution, at least until the early 90s, it was a coordination body for the Western countries during the Cold War. In a divided world, and where the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc were having a Cold War and were fighting by proxy in many places around the world, but not directly in Europe. So the G7 had a different meaning. As I said at the beginning, the G7 has evolved. It doesn't represent the numbers that it represented in 1975. There has been, thank God, a rise of the others. There are other countries. For example, this morning we woke up to the re-election of Erdogan. So Turkey has become an amazing regional reality. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Japan is what it is, but then we have Korea that is rising dramatically. China has become what it has become. So the world is not what it was back in 1975. And Russia is not only not the Soviet Union, but for some mysterious reason has decided to commit suicide. But that's proper to Russia. The G7 today is not a body against somebody. As I said at the beginning, it is a control tower of where liberal democracies want to go. It is just a coordination body among 7 liberal democracies. One of them is the biggest in the world. The others are smaller, but there is a regional context in it. There is a historic tradition. We coordinate as much as we can. We coordinate with other countries, and we try to reaffirm what we see as possible actions on different geopolitical and geoeconomical issues. But the G7 does not have the ambition to rule the world or to say this is how things have to be done. We reach out to other countries. We reach out not only to the global south, but we reach out to China. We have stated very clearly that we want to live with China, and we do not want to hamper China's growth, economic growth and development in any way. We just want to make clear how we're going to behave on certain issues, what we have as red lines. And I think it is in their own right of the G7 to do this. This does not mean that they're against somebody. They're just outlining their view of issues and very open to discussion. The discussion go on in the G20, in the United Nations, in the COP28, in the WTO, and in many other multilateral fora where we open up and where we discuss international crises together. So I think the G7 has evolved a lot from the one you saw and I saw with you back in '75 to today. It has changed a lot, but it's certainly has no ambition to rule the world. On the contrary, the ambition maybe is to coordinate better with the rest of the world.
So I had another curiosity or question which has already been answered by Luca, so I would devote the last 10 minutes we have of his availability for questions from the floor, if there are. Pastor De Ferrara is willing to answer 2 or 3 questions. If you can raise your hands, I will take them all together, and then we could provide an answer for all them. Ambassador of Korea, of the Republic of Korea, please, the floor is yours.
Ambassador, for this very interesting presentation. Actually, to both ambassadors for this very stimulating conversation. We had a more clearer understanding of how Italy is leading next G7 under your presidency. Probably you have touched upon this question already, but in your sum up of Hiroshima summit, you mentioned Asia-centric aspect of this G7, and you already mentioned the rise of China. My question to you is how Italian presidency would like to pay more attention to that region, to that side of the world. I understand Puglia has been the place for the next G7 meeting, and the reason behind that is that Puglia has been the place where East and West met in the past. I understand Italian presidency has some already implication when you choose the place for your next summit meeting. Could you more specifically elaborate your plan, how you would like to pay more attention to that side of the world? Since I'm the ambassador of South Korea, this is why I raised this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I have another question. I will take them together. There. Can you introduce yourself, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Nicolas Bouchou. I'm advising the T7 Japan, and I was also working in the T20 during the G20 Italy. My question will be very short. Italy was chairing the G20 not long ago in 2021 and should be chairing the G7 next year. How do you, how is it possible to consolidate results from one presidency to the other? You insisted on factors of continuity, but we can also see that on many occasions there is a lot of loss of institutional memory, even in a short period of time, and how to then better consolidate results from one presidency to the other. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the outstanding presentation. I'm Martina Rogato from the Women 7, the G7 official engagement group of the G7 on gender equity and equality. We really appreciate the focus of the G7 Leaders Declaration on genders, 3 paragraphs on it with an intersectional lens. And can we expect anything similar next year? There will be also a gender mainstream topic related to climate, energy, migration. Thank you so much.
It's always tricky to talk to the floor. Yeah. So this is certainly the world pendulum has moved towards Asia. We cannot deny that Asia today represents more than 30% of GDP. But overall, what's even more important is that in the coming 10 years, it will grow very much, and it will represent more than 40% of world demand. That means that every 2 items we build in Italy, we will have to sell 1 in Asia or to Asians. So we're an export-oriented country. So for us, the relationship with Asia will be a strategic relationship. It will be very important. And I think that at the end of the day, we're very lucky that the the G7 that was held before ours was held by Japan, because it brought us into an Asian reality that we will try to carry on as much as possible in Apulia, which is a land where East and West have historically met, as you underlined. So I believe that many of the items that we discussed in Hiroshima will be on the agenda in Apulia. There's no doubt about that. It's a question of how much Asia is growing and how much it is important in world economy, world politics, in world crisis, unfortunately, and so on. As for the carrying on the torch from one presidency to the other, that's the duty of the Sherpas. So it's my duty to take things on from Kei-san, my Japanese colleague, and do my best. He did his best with his German predecessor. We do the same with the G20. I don't think that things are lost, because 80% of our discussions, whenever we are, you know, the Sherpas, we have these long lasting negotiations that go on all night on one word of the, when you read those communiques of 20, 30 pages, you won't believe it, but we really discussed it word by word. And when we do that, and when there's a problem on one word, we always look at the previous meetings, at the ministerial meetings, at the previous G7 meetings, and even at G20 meetings. Oh, but this was the language we adopted at G20, so we can use that. So there is a priority given to the historical data we carry. We always carry historical data with us. Another thing we do is that we carry on the experts. So many of the people who worked, correct me if I'm wrong, Fausto, many of the people, Fausto is my sous Sherpa, he's been doing this for 5 years. He knows much more than me. So Fausto was, what we did, we're hiring a group of experts which were the same that we used during the G20, which were the same that we used during the G7. So there's a lot of history there which is carried on from that point of view. So yes, we make a special effort to try and maintain a continuity between G7s and in their interaction with G20. We do as much as we can. Sometimes we fail. The last question was on the gender. Gender will be an item of conversation, of course. We are favored by the fact that the only woman prime minister is the prime minister of Italy. But that's not the only gender issue in the world. But certainly we will discuss gender issues as we have discussed them in Hiroshima. There's a specific G7 group dedicated to equal opportunity and gender. So the discussion will be on and will be in depth, and we will try to carry on the torch on that issue as well as on the many other issues.
Luca, thank you very much for your frankness, straightforwardness, sincerity, but also a rather comprehensive way of presenting all the subjects that we will have to face in the next months to come until the beginning of the presidency and up to the holding of the summit, I assume, next June in Italy, in Puglia. And I would ask you to join me in applauding and thanking Ambassador Ferrari.
Hello everyone. Thank you so much for those who are in the room and for those who are connected online. My name is Daniele Fattibene. I'm Associate Fellow at Istituto Affari Internazionali and also coordinator of the European Think Tanks Group, which is a network of 6 think tanks dealing with development cooperation in Europe and European foreign policy. EIE is one of the members. I'm very happy to chair this panel on G7 and Global South and Global North cooperation. And I'm very happy to have with us guests, the experts that the Sherpa just mentioned, but also practitioners and representatives of key institutions and key organizations that will lead the process. So I'm very happy to invite the speakers to come. First, we have a virtual speaker, Anna-Katarina Ornic, Director of the German Institute of Development and Sustainability. Hi, Anna-Katarina. Also, it's a pity you couldn't join us, but we are very happy that you can discuss with us the topic of climate agenda, which is a very burning topic today. From the Ministry of Finance, Francesca Utili, Head of the International Financial Relations Directorate. We also have Paolo Lombardo, Director of the International Cooperation and Development Finance of Cassa Depositi e Prestiti. And I'm also inviting here Valeria Emmi, spokesperson of the Global Call to Action Against Poverty, and then Professor Sonobe, who is Dean and CEO of the Asian Development Bank Institute that played a key role in the T7. I will start from our virtual guest, Anna-Katarina Ornic. My question, we will cover in this panel several burning issues that have been mentioned by the ambassador within the G7 agenda. And I would like to start from the climate one. We know that climate cooperation and climate finance is one of the issues that burns a lot of the debates between the global north and the global south. High-income countries have pledged to invest a significant amount of money, $100 billion through 2025 to mobilize sustainable climate finance. So I would like to hear your opinion on this, and also drawing on the experience that IDOS carried out under the previous T7. What is, from the think tank community, your advice and your position on this? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniele, for the kind introduction. Thank you to the Institute for inviting, for organizing this important event, and for also assuring that the triage, one might say, of the different G7 presidencies, Japan currently, Italy in the coming year, and Germany from last year, are coming together to jointly reflect on the challenges. I would like to start by acknowledging, first of all, the already mentioned 100 billion that have not been met yet. And of course, we know that these 100 billion are in the end not sufficient. Nevertheless, meeting this target line is, of course, of crucial importance. It's also of symbolic, politically speaking, symbolic importance. Having said this, we realize, or we have to really ramp up ambition and think about different quantities at different sums. I just want to refer here to the discussions by Antonio Guterres, who speaks of the SDG stimulus and suggests the introduction of an SDG stimulus on the level of the G20 this year. He here argues that around 500 billion US dollar are required per year in order to accelerate Agenda 2030 implementation. We also have one of the newest reports by the International Monetary Fund and authored by Amar Bhattacharya and colleagues, who argue that, or who estimate that the requirements, the finance requirements for Agenda 2030 and for meeting the climate challenges range around 1.3 trillion US dollar per year up to 2025, and around 3.5 trillion US dollar per year up by basically beyond 2025. So we are in a situation where it's clear we have to act now, we have to act very decisively, and as a united international community. But of course, we are all aware that exactly this unitedness is not as easy as we would hope. I would like to briefly touch on a number of instruments that are being discussed again and again, and I would like to emphasize here as instruments, policy instruments, in order to to further mobilize finances, and here also, of course, blended finance, public and private. I think we've it's very clear that the Agenda 2030 and the Paris Agreement act as guiding lamps, act as or give a clear sense of direction, and this has to be reiterated again and again. Exactly in the current situation, it would often be a lot easier also to so to say step away from Agenda 2030. Politically speaking, it might be easier, but exactly I think that must not happen. So I'm very happy that also last year and this year the discussions on the level of the G7 as well as on the level of the G20, the discussions that we can so far follow, agree or continue to re-emphasize the focus on the Agenda 2030 and of course on the Paris Agreement, the climate agreement. I think if you think about tools, policy instruments that have to be discussed, we have on the one side carbon pricing as a policy tool that has to be discussed and also has to be discussed as part or in the WTO. I think that is very important, not just carbon pricing itself, but also especially the carbon border adjustment mechanism that we have installed in the European Union context, which of course has effects on quite a number of not only neighboring countries, but of course on all those economies that trade with us, so we're on our direct partners. I think that's then further I would like to emphasize in the ongoing discussions on mobilizing private capital and thinking about blended finance. We have to link these discussions with ongoing discussions on the reforms or reforming the multinational, the international financial institutions, namely the World Bank as well as the International Monetary Fund. We have, of course, the Bridgetown Initiative that explicitly targets helping or assisting, enabling least developed economies and economies in debt in the situation of the climate crisis hitting. So basically in the acute moment of climate change effects being felt. And then, of course, we have that sort of the immediate activities or the financial structures that enable that immediate coping is possible. But of course, at the same time, we need to heavily mobilize and invest into mitigation activities. The Just Energy Transition Partnership instrument is one that has to be mentioned here. Aside to the carbon pricing instrument, I think it's very important to assure that this newly established instrument is actually now being developed and in a successful manner with always in collaboration basically with the countries that have signed these JETPs. And here what I sense, or the state of discussion as I read it, is that it's not as easy to actually assure that this instrument can be turned into a fruitful one. But even more so, it's important that the G7 puts particular attention to it and so finds way of assuring that this instrument, just as others that have that are based on an idea of reciprocal partnership, actually are turned into successes. Similarly, we could argue that the climate club that has been formed last year has to now this year really be developed further as an instrument that fosters reciprocal partnerships that allow the joint shaping of transformational processes towards sustainability. So given the current state of discussions within the G7, I would like to end basically by emphasizing the facilitating of these discussions around concrete policy instruments that allow coping, as well as, of course, adapting and then mitigating. And one might name this in the other way around, basically mitigating, adapting, coping. But all instruments have in common that they need to be, of course, developed over a longer period of time. And what we've seen in the past several years is that using the discussions on the level of the G7 as discussions that prepare or have already partly been prepared on the level of the COP, for instance, the Just Energy Transition Partnership Instrument, as well as the Climate Club Instrument, that had been prepared on the level of the climate negotiations at the COPs each time. Then they could be taken forward within the G7 context. They could be taken forward also within the G20 context, and then basically move into another into the next year in order to then not only having been signed or created as the Climate Club, for instance, but now have to be actually put into action. Seeing again the example of the Just Energy Transition Partnership Instrument. I think that's very encouraging to see how basically we put an emphasis on creating continuity by making use of these different multilateral, partly also international, if we think of the climate conferences as part of this, multilateral basically platforms, the different club platforms that allow us to jointly prepare, discuss, then decide, and actually move into the cycle of implementation, and through this potentially accelerate action, which of course is very much needed. Thank you, Daniele.
Thank you so much, Anna Katarina, for this. You touched upon very interesting topics and also very debated issues between the global north and the global south, where we know it's not easy to build unanimity and consensus. So it will be crucial to see how this will evolve in the next few months. Before giving the floor to the panelists here, let me just remind you that you can also interact online in this webinar. You can use the Q&A function, and then I will do my best. It's not easy because there are almost 80 people connected to pick up the questions for the panelists. Please also indicate the panelists to whom you would like to address your question. Now, let me go to this side of the room, and I really would like to now hear from Francesca Utili from the Ministry of Finance. We heard a lot about the importance of building the synergies between G7 and G20, and we know that some of the issues where consensus needs to be built and reached are those around the reform of the multilateral development banks, the IFIs, also the issue of global health. How do you see, and what are in your work plan the activities or the initiatives that at the moment, but also next year, the Italian G7 presidency would like to work on and to build again more consensus on these very important topics on which we know that the low-income countries will be already have been affected by the pandemic, will be more affected in the future.
Thanks a lot for your question, and thanks also, let me start by thanking the President, Ambassador Nelly Feroci, for his kind invitation, and Vice President Greco. And indeed, the directorate I'm responsible of, which is International Financial Relationship at the Ministry, at the Ministry of Finance, had during the last G20 presidency a very fruitful cooperation with the Institute, and we're really happy to be here today. Indeed, we also look forward to cooperation with Ambassador Ferrari, which we've been listening to very carefully, and all the Sherpa team, as finance track and Sherpas should do during presidencies. On the G7 role in international cooperation and the relationship with Global South, of course, the G7 has been seen in several processes as trying to lead by example, but a very, very relevant additional aspect of the interaction with other countries to foster cooperation within international fora, in particular within the G20. And indeed, as also Ambassador Ferrari was mentioning, the experience of Japan, which we attended for the finance side, so we were not in Hiroshima, we were in Niigata, also showed us physically the importance of having the presence of the Troika G20 presidencies, so India, Indonesia, and Brazil, as well as Comoros in representation of the African Union, and South Korea and Singapore. And we really believe that this outreach, which can, of course, only be limited to part of the conversation, is still extremely important and relevant to make progress within the international fora. In addressing a few issues that I believe are very relevant to foster dialogue with the Global South, I will also give a little bit of my views and of information on what could be areas of continuity with the current G7 presidency, as well as areas which are very dear to us of continuity with the recent 2021 G20 presidency. And the areas I will touch upon will be MDB reforms, climate issues, and health to start with. Looking at MDB reforms, the issues at stake now are around the reflection on how to better respond to challenges, which are indeed global challenges, so climate, pandemic, fragility, which need a supranational dimension to be addressed, but where the position of countries are differentiated, as some are asking to those institutions to ask to their shareholders for capital increases. There is a generalized fear on the part of low-income countries that this attention to global challenges could lead to a reduction of concessional resources to them, shifting them towards other countries, middle income, that are, of course, affected also by the global challenges. And indeed, there is also an issue of definition of what those global challenges are, as we can also consider as such food security, energy access, debt issues. And in this debate, which has started at the World Bank, the position that Italy has been following is to really keep the core mandate of the institution of eradicating poverty at the center, but of course consider the interaction that global challenges have on the fact itself of eradicating poverty, of boosting shared prosperity, and of the need to protect the most vulnerable, which are very often the most affected by those global challenges. So in this respect, the idea is to really keep focusing the concessional resources on the most vulnerable, but also consider other relevant aspects which include better involvement of the private sector and a better use of existing resources. And here, building on an activity that was launched by the Italian G20 presidency, which is the Capital Adequacy Framework Review, where a panel of independent researchers was tasked to find ways to better leverage existing resources of multilateral development bank. And they have prepared a report which has then been presented within the Indian presidency. So we now already have continuity between G20 presidencies. And this report, which is currently under discussion in all the boards of the multilateral development banks, starting for the World Bank, Bank, where the discussion is more advanced, but also the Asian Development Bank, for example, is really freeing up headroom for more investment and financing. And already results that were agreed upon at the spring meetings last April for the World Bank will free up 50 billion of resources in 10 years. So we really see this as a very promising avenue, which should be followed further, and we definitely intend to keep pushing for that within our presidency, also to address the challenges that our colleague Anne-Catherine was just mentioning beforehand. On climate, as the issue has been already touched upon with a lot of important elements and information, of course, financial issues will be at the center, and the G7 will be called to show ambition in addressing that. But let me focus on specific issues which also relate to what we have heard from Ambassador Ferrari on economic security, economic autonomy, and strategic positioning of the G7 towards dependencies. And this is focusing, first of all, on keeping energy transition and energy security as mutually reinforcing, and looking at an initiative which is now under scrutiny by the G7 Japanese presidency, which is called RISE, which is Resilient and Inclusive Supply Chain Enhancement in the Era of Decarbonization, which basically already contains in the title all the relevant elements, which would be to establish partnership with areas of the world that could be notably, for example, in Africa, as the Mediterranean dimension was mentioned before, and areas of the world that could be resource rich, that could help in diversifying the supply of strategic key materials, but that at the same time could provide their support also in the production of goods. And as Japan is starting this initiative, it will be launched in the autumn. It could be an initiative that Italy could look at with interest and work to follow it up. The last item that I would like to stress to your attention is global health. And indeed, during the Italian G20 presidency, Italy has positioned itself at the forefront of the response to the COVID pandemic and to the analysis of how great have been the economic and social costs of that, and what could be done to avoid finding themselves in such a difficult situation. So the first answer is, of course, preparedness and prevention. And under the Italian G20 presidency, a task force was built, putting together the finance and the health track, as it was clear from the experience of the pandemic that the two tracks had to work together in order to have all the important points of views that were needed, and the competencies, the skills, and responsibilities that could lead to effective answers. The activity of the task force has led to the establishment of a pandemic fund, which is currently more focused on prevention and preparedness for the benefit of the most vulnerable countries. The Japanese G7 presidency, so now we are really working together on both sides, from the G20 side and the G7 side. The Japanese G7 presidency is focusing more on the response side, and they are proposing a surge mechanism, which could be a way to mobilize very quickly the resources, not only financial resources, but all the resources that would be needed to answer very rapidly to the possibility of further pandemics. So that's indeed an area that builds up on the work that Italy has already been doing, that could put additional added value that could be definitely of interest to us. And looking also at what has happened and how the less developed countries have been more affected by the impact of the pandemics, it would also be interesting to look at how one could think of boosting also the productive capacity of developing states, notably starting from the African continent. I think I will stop here for now, and I'll be glad, of course, to answer to your questions.
Thanks so much, and I think this very last point on the local manufacturing is something that in some regions of the world, especially Sub-Saharan Africa, is particularly important. We know that Senegal has been reaching almost 70%, I think, of local capacity to manufacture the next vaccine. So I'm really glad to hear that also on a future pandemic preparedness would be important role given by the G7 presidency on this in cooperation with G20. And it's good that we have also in the room representatives of several countries that are already members or invited members or invited countries to the summit, because maybe they can also react on that. Let me now go to the implementers. We know that Cassa Depositi e Prestiti has been playing an increasingly important role on several issues dealing with sustainability and international cooperation. CDP organized very successfully the Financing Common Summit in 2021, and I think since then you have been called more and more from your partners also to be, pioneers and leading actors in this field. So I would like to hear from Director Lombardo something about the GEFIC. We know that CDP, together with the European partners, are members of this European Financiers for International Cooperation group. So I would like to hear from you, how would you like both to partner with European counterparts within this group to support the G7 presidency in delivering through effective implementation on the ground the ambitions that we are been listening from Ambassador Ferrari.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you for the organizers to invite us. Let me just start making just one small introduction. Cassa Depositi e Prestiti is one of the oldest and largest promotional banks. We were set up 170 years ago. But when it comes to development finance, we've only been around for a few years. So we are basically the new kid in town, but as I will now describe, we've been quite active, and in particular in working together with our partners. So Ambassador Ferrari set the stage by highlighting how prominent the issues facing development, our development partners will be, have been facing, the kind of issues they've been facing and what they're likely to face in the future. We are looking at helping our partners in ensuring economic security. I think what we're all aiming for is shared prosperity. I do not think that within a G7 year, Italy will be able to tackle all the issues. But when it comes to some of the topics, I think Ambassador Ferrari referred to the continuity between one presidency and the other. Our aim will be to take one step forward. And the way we intend to do this, and it was just alluded to, is the fact that you have to take these steps together with like-minded partners. So we mentioned food security, we mentioned connecting infrastructure, sustainable value chains. I mean, we're all interconnected. So the first thing that CDP has been doing since we were asked to take this particular role was actually to tie up with our partners to be able then to jointly address these issues. And we've done this in multiple ways. GEFIC is only one of the partnerships that we've set up. But I would like to stress that partnerships are a great thing, but then it's also the ability of the players to deliver. So we've actually prepared ourselves for the role that we, been given to us, and for the role we will take in the G7 in two ways. Let me just start with the operational side. In order to be credible in partnerships, you need to prove you can do it. You need to prove you have the financial resources, you have the human capital to put those resources to good use. And over the last 4 years, we have basically tied up with our partners, and we have basically structured deals across the globe around 2 billion euros. We have about 50 to 55% in the African continent. We've also worked very much in the Near East, so in North Africa. This is a particular important area for us, without, however, basically forgetting about Asia and Latin America. In all of these operations, we have partnered up with the leading development finance institutions or development banks. Here we are now with basically a proven track record. How did we basically take a step forward on the association with other players? First of all, we basically are European, so we tend to look closer to where we are, but we are also linked to basically all the development players around the world. JFIC is one of the latest creations, is a joint European partnership for financing in Europe, which comprises the largest players in Europe. Together, we basically have a financial power of around 20 billion euros a year. These are significant movements, levels of financial resources. But behind those resources, you actually have a commonality of views. I referred earlier to being like-minded players. It is fundamental to resolve the kind of challenges that I alluded to earlier and that Ambassador Ferrari referred to in his eloquent introduction, is that what sounds like huge resources are actually nothing compared to the needs of our partners. So it is essential that we put those resources together in the best possible way. So JFIC and other platforms are not just a co-financing platform, but are places where basically we agree on strategies together. We agree on how to implement, how to engage with our partners. And I'm referring to partners now in emerging markets. We have one unique feature relative to other players. We are both operating in the private sector, in the public sector. So quite often, when we talk to, for example, our partners in the JFIC platform, which is fundamentally a public sector platform, we can bring knowledge and insights that actually can help us structure deals on the public sector side, because more and more we see a shift towards private financing. Only a month ago, we signed up in Tokyo an agreement with G7 DFIs around Ukraine investment platform. This is not just European, but this is just another example of how CDP has been basically working quite hard in ensuring that we are sitting at the tables that actually will eventually shape the reconstruction, in this case, of Ukraine in a way that actually is in line with our basically values and our strategies. This platform will be announced at the Ukraine conference in London in June. There's also other platforms of European nature. EDFI is another one where all the DFIs, the European DFIs, basically share standards and strive to basically one goal, to achieve the best possible impact in the countries where we operate. So partnership, I would say, is the key word. There's another initiative that we're part of, and once again, CDP has been quite an active proponent. It's something that came out under the G7 presidency, and it's called the Partnership for Global Infrastructure. It was launched in Germany, as I just said, in 22, and it was highlighted the need to be more focused on sustainable infrastructure, and there is a soft pledge of investing 600 billion among the participants of this group in infrastructure projects in partner countries over the next five years. So fundamentally, I would say we would like to become a bridge once Italy takes the presidency of the G7 among all of the European, but I would also say G7 development partners and development financiers in ensuring that basically we put those resources that we all collectively have in line with the priorities that Italy will eventually set for the G7 presidency led by Italy. Thank you.
Thanks, Director Lombardo. I think you mentioned extremely relevant points, the capacity to deliver and to match ambitions with the effectiveness of the programs on the field. And despite being, I would say, not a kid, a teenager in the group, you have been proving to be, more and more active and more politically reliable and visible at the international stage. So it's important that also, for instance, in the next Financing Commons Summit, the whole experience and the whole legacy that you had in Rome and in Abidjan could also lead another regions of the world, which is usually a little bit underrated in this courses, Latin America, in this group of leading countries and regions to achieve sustainable development. And you also raised the importance of data and research to prove the effectiveness and also to deliver properly the programs launched on the field. And on this, I would like to go to Professor Sonobe. You have been eye-witnessing, and you're still eye-witnessing this year with the Think 7, one of the engagement groups of the G7, an important role of think tanks in accompanying the leaders, but also in bringing on board the voice of the research in the policy-making debate. The final communique urged the creation of this G7, G20 dashboard to help deliver the research and reliable data. So I would like to hear from you, what is your position on this particular deliverable that was also mentioned in the final communique? Are you planning also to work in the future, because the legacy and the continuity is also with, let's say, the think tanks and not necessarily with the states. So what's your view on that, and how you can share your experience on that?
Thank you very much, EI, for including me in this very important workshop. And also taking this opportunity, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to Ettore Greco for providing very excellent speeches and interventions at the T7 Summit Japan, T7 Japan Summit in Tokyo 1 month ago, and also Francesca Utili for being the really wonderful panelist at our T7 event as part of ADB's annual meeting held in Incheon, Korea, about 3 weeks ago. Thank you very much. And then today I have 3 points before, maybe 2 points before answering Daniel's question about the dashboard and continuity. The first one is I just want to echo the Sherpa Ambassador Ferrari that G7 is really indispensable to the world in achieving global peace, global sustainable development, and global liberal democracy. Right? So very important institution. And then G7 try to achieve these goals through more effective North-South cooperation. And then actually G7 members are the major providers of bilateral cooperation assistance for the development in the Global South. And also, G7 members are great supporter for multilateral efforts for the same purpose. And G7 itself is one of the major symbols of multilateralism. So now I turn to my second point, which is about T7, which EI will lead next year. Okay, so for G7 leaders, or G7 to function better, so G7 leaders need to know what the people on the planet needs, okay? How G7 can help the people on the planet achieve more environmentally, socially, and economically prosperous society, right? And then, of course, G7 leaders are always informed about those needs of people by their excellent public officers and the fellow politicians and their supporters. But nonetheless, G7 leaders want to listen to the diverse voices from the civil societies. So under G7, there are engagement groups, official engagement groups, such as Youth 7, W7, Think 7, Science 7, Civil Society 7, Civil 7, or Labor and Business. So, and then you can easily see that think tank groups are a bit different, because other groups have very clear, straightforward messages. You can imagine what the W7 would say, or the U7 a bit, but U7 says, you know, they are young, so they have a long time horizon, because they live many years from now. So that's a difference from the, you know, like me. So that's their specialty. But the think tank group do not have such straightforward message. But nonetheless, think tank group is maybe the only one group which consider the constraints, like budget constraint that government faces, and try to provide solutions rather than conveying the voices and demands and needs only. That's a difference. And then T7 is relatively new. T7 started last year under G7 German presidency. And then this year, T7 Japan is going on. And the T7 Japan has three major themes. One is addressing current crises, such as such as food crisis, energy crisis, debt crisis, and of course the climate crisis, especially and also the biodiversity crisis, especially the big gap between the necessity and the reality in terms of climate change adaptation, and biodiversity also. And then these crises are, of course, much severer in the Global South. So this is about the North-South cooperation. And then second theme is the igniting the SDGs, efforts toward the SDGs, which has been slowed down during the pandemic. The third is the bridging G7 and the G20 through the close collaboration between T7 and the T20. And both T7 and the T20 are open to think tanks in the world. So the participating organizations or think tanks are same group. But nonetheless, there are big difference between T7 and T20 because agenda setting is very different. Because, for example, T7 Japan has discussed seriously the peace, nuclear, disarmament, and nuclear non-proliferation. But those things cannot be discussed at all in India, T20, which is going on right now. So although the same participants, but the topics are totally different. So a while ago in the panel, first session, there was a very interesting discussion about G20 representativeness. G20 seems to be more representative than G7. But actually, we need more, more diverse fora for discussion. Otherwise, we cannot discuss very important issues. So especially T7 and the T20, both are very important. And maybe the think tank discussions directly related to BRICS will be important. Especially maybe 3 or 4 years later, G20 presidency will go to the US, then T7 T20 or G7 G20 become very similar. So maybe we will listen to we should have a kind of another forum related to BRICS. So that's second. And then the third is the dashboard. Okay, so this is what we call G7 G20 dashboard. So as you know, every G7 and the G20 summit, there have been a large number of commitments, promises, and pledges. And then a while ago, the Ambassador Ferrari said the Sherpas are very careful about continuity in the G7, G20, and the last year G7, the next year G7. But to the public, the continuity of those things are not at all clear, right? Far from the visible. And then when it comes to the real impact of those commitments and promises on the planet and the people, very, very unclear. So we, T7 Japan, propose starting the design of G7, G20 dashboard to monitor what commitments are being implemented or just ignored, or it can have any real impact. So this is very difficult. And then, so maybe as a T7 Japan chair, I'm very happy because I could propose very nice, nice new project. And then the P7 Italy will have to work on that. So, but don't worry, the global think tank community all join this important, should join, because this is really think tank kind of project. And then I have some idea. I'm discussing with my advisor and some other colleagues, including Anta Katarina Honic, about how to implement this dashboard. Maybe it will be like open sourced from the volunteers, like a little bit like Wikipedia, but different from Wikipedia because Wikipedia is completely anonymous. But in this case, we should give credit to the writers and also who criticize and revise. So then global participation may make this great project possible. So I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, and it's easy and it's nice to hear that also coordination that we require to the policymakers is the first thing that we should also apply to the work of think tanks. And it's yes.
I forgot to talk about the continuity itself.
Okay.
So everybody, when I assumed the position of the chair of T7, the people like Anna Katarina and Denis Sunoa, and then Bambam Brojonegoro from Indonesia, who chaired T20 Indonesia last year. And all those people told me that continuity is important. And then my understanding initially was very shallow. Yeah, continuity is indeed important because it would be absurd to start from scratch every year. That's the weakness of the rotating, secretariat and the chairmanship. But I think continuity is really important because of this dashboard. To do dashboard, there must be real continuity. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, and it will be important next year to partner with your experience, with IDOS, with the Asian Development Bank Institute, and also with the colleagues in Indonesia and Brazil to make sure that this is happening. Now I'd like to turn to Valeria Emmi. We know that this year is crucial for SDGs. We are experiencing with the Poli crisis, the COVID pandemic, the climate emergency, a lot of reverse trends in SDGs implementation. But we know that in September, in the SDG summit, global leaders will have to deliver and will have also to present the results in this very difficult path towards the Agenda 2030. So my question to you is, civil society plays a great role in being the watchdogs of the policymakers, in making sure that what is politically promised is then achieved, or at least reaching the ground where you were very much involved. So what is your assessment of the summit, and also what is the expectation that you as CSO community and also representative would like to expect from the next presidency, and are there lessons learned from the current presidency that could be applied to next year?
Thanks a lot, Daniele, for this critical question. But before I answer to your question, just let me start by saying thanks to Istituto Affari Internazionali and Focus 2030 for organizing this event, for this invitation, and for stimulating the debate and opening the dialogue, because this is truly indispensable to gather momentum and to gather momentum for a better exchange and make the ambition mentioned by the ambassador, Italian Sherpa, Mr. Ferrari, real, concrete. And this helped me to answer to your question, actually, because I'm here representing GCAP Italy, a global call to action against poverty, which is the Italian coalition engaged in the G20 and G7 processes, and is the key interlocutor of the Italian institutions on the G20 and G7 processes. Just talking about continuity, which is, I'd say, a key word came up today in this discussion. And we are active member of this official engagement group, one of the official engagement group named Civil 7, representing more than 700 organizations coming from 70 countries, not 70 countries. So we have a really global perspective. And we act as a collective group to channel influence to the G7 countries, to contribute to shaping G7 agendas, commitments, and practice with concrete solution. And we are actually deeply rooted on our experience on the ground, as you mentioned, and in the need of civil society and the most vulnerable people and communities. Therefore, we build on and strengthen this interaction, this interactive connection between civil society organizations on the ground at local level and the G7 playing field, by bringing local realities and global voices together, just to make the reality lived by vulnerable people every day on the table, bring it on the table. And this means that we are in a unique position, actually, to make demands for concrete actions to ensure spaces of consistent exchange and of open and democratic dialogue. So, leveraging on our locally and globally linked experience, this is the kind of dialogue we would like to build with the Italian government, that we are trying to build on with the previous presidency, Japanese presidency included. And especially now, this is important because it's relevant and crucial because of the current crisis we are experiencing. The current crisis, which have been so well called to mind by those who preceded me. In fact, indeed, the impacts of climate crisis, of COVID-19 pandemic, of the prolonged indebtedness of many countries, of the Russian aggressions against Ukraine, are triggering a global permanent state of crisis with dramatic impacts that are magnifying, actually, a number of critical, structural, and systemic challenges. Systemic challenges that have been unaddressed for far too long. So our main question, our main recommendations are to deliver and to tackle these issues in a concrete way with an urgent approach, but at the same time with a long-term vision. And we are aware of the fact that these impacts of the crisis are generating more poverty, already mentioned, food and nutrition security, mentioned by the ambassador as well, hunger in some countries and areas and populations, risk of famine, environmental degradation, which are driving humanitarian needs to record levels, gender inequalities, economic and political instabilities, increasingly severe and protracted violent conflicts, forced migratory flows, and are actually all of these crises, all of these elements are exacerbating pre-existing inequalities within countries, trapped by inequalities between countries. So these global challenges require common resolve, strong international approach and solidarity, centrality of human rights, and UN-centered multilateral process to firmly advance on the pathway towards the sustainability, to address systemic issues and to create open and resilient societies, stimulate a change. These global challenges require a systemic revision of the political approach, adopting a gender transformative approach with the determination of leaving no one behind, with a comprehensive vision for a real sustainability and the policy coherence to link together the future of the planet and of the humankind. So the G7 and the Italian next presidency can play a relevant, critical role in building consensus on accelerating the action needed to advance the agenda for sustainable development. And at the same time, to prevent the multi-layered crisis from reaching catastrophic level. And this means paying critical attention to human rights, protecting diversity and biodiversity, means social, economic, food and climate justice, means taking care of vulnerabilities, means human mobility, means also debt relief and a long-term debt sustainability, means ensuring, for instance, that low and middle-income countries could have the adequate fiscal space to confront their critical development challenges. This means fostering global public goods, health and education. This means strengthening a renewed commitment of the G7 to save people and planet from catastrophic climate change. And this means eventually building peace, prosperity with ambition, the same ambition mentioned by the Italian Sherpa. So the bottom line is, with the value of participation and collaboration at the core of this engagement group of the Civil Seven, we significantly continue playing our role, and we are sure that the Italian government and the other countries of the G7 will do its utmost to make this participation real, exactly to make the link between the European countries, the 7 countries, and the Mediterranean countries, the African countries, to make the link at global level and do and act as with a global and active leadership. So we are very much looking forward to continuing, collaborating, and engaging effectively.
Yeah, now it's working. You mentioned the importance of the global public goods, and I think this is something of which G7 countries do have the capacity to deliver. Some people have, suffered and have been hit the most by the different crises that you mentioned. So it's important to deliver on that. We know that a lot of countries are in debt distress or are facing debt distress very soon. So it's crucial that this global public goods agenda brings all these dimensions on board to deliver. I would like now to open the floor for comments, questions from the audience. I already have one online. I know that Anna Caterina will have to leave in 20 minutes, so probably I will give you a little bit the floor first. But please raise your hands, introduce yourselves, and then we can pick 2 or 3 questions. I already have one, and then we can address the panelists. So who wants to ice break? We have a big room, so be brave. Wow, I will start with my question, but then there is one question online on the next summit in Paris, the summit for the new financial pacts. It's addressed specifically to Francesca Utili, but I think everyone can answer that. So to leave a little bit the burden on and to share the burden on each of you. And the question is about the expectations on this summit. We know that President Macron has been invested a lot politically on that, and I think this is also a crucial moment to build also the dialogue in light of the next G20 summit, but also in light of the stock-taking moment that FAO with a key role played, but also the Italian government will have on food systems transformations 2 years after the food system summit. So from the speakers, maybe we can go around and in reverse round, starting from Anna Caterina, since she has to leave soon. What is your expectations about this summit? In your case, it's more the research demand, but what is the outcomes that you expect from this?
Yeah, thank you for this question. And if I may, I will combine it also with a question that I had not answered in my short statement, but you had formulated earlier, which goes in the direction of which role can Think 7 or these think processes in general play. But on the summit first, what do we expect? Well, I think we really expect a preparation of, one could maybe say, a Team Europe approach within the G20 towards the MDB reform discussions, as well as with regards to addressing the debt crisis. And this is very clear that the unfolding debt crisis, unfolding across the globe and actually across all countries of different income levels, has to be addressed. It requires a substantial G7 leadership and also European leadership in that manner. And we expect some substantial steps forward here, but we'll have to see. And of course, it has to be then backed up not only financially, but also with the respective united political will. I would like to, because I assume it's the last opportunity for me to speak, would like to say a few words on these advisory processes to the G7, but also the G20. My institute was one of the two institutes mandated with the Think 7 advisory process last year under German G7 presidency, and we are very grateful that we can contribute to the process also this year. Tetsushi, it's an honor to see you again here today, even if I unfortunately cannot join in person. And we, of course, stand ready to do the same under the Italian presidency. And we do that for probably 4 reasons that I want to underline. The Think 7 or Think 20 processes, they on the one side, of course, have the purpose to offer expertise, to offer latest insights from applied research and think tank work to the policy making processes, and that we do through the different policy briefs, through lots and lots of interactions, direct, bilateral, but also multilateral, so to say, interactions with policymakers across the different country spaces. And by doing that, of course, we instill, that's the second aspect, instill what we could call science diplomacy. I think that's something that we need to underline, the crucial role of these dialogue processes. We basically aim at bringing the different spaces of resonance, of intellectual resonance of the different policymakers in the respective countries together, and already prepare in some ways some of the epistemic infrastructures, one could say, and intellectual infrastructures that are crucial for building the dialogue processes that then at some stage result in policy-making decisions. This year, especially if we think of the G7, G20 interactions, we have seen a lot of focus in our interactions with our Indian colleagues on identifying where the political foci converge, and the focus we in a way structured the interactions more and more over the past months with a clear focus on where do we converge, where do we continue come together, where do we continue agreeing on the Agenda 2030, but not just on the overall Agenda 2030, but exactly which areas can we identify where joint action is necessary, and where joint policy decisions also are possible or seem possible in the current situation. Now, third, of course, these activities that hope to contribute to not only sectoral, cross-sectoral, but also cross-scalar coordination, and in many ways we hope to contribute to policy coherence, both aspects that we always call for ourselves, and then of course too, that's the fourth point, the temporal continuity across the different presidencies. I will, Daniela, I will end here, but I apologize that I took a bit more time, but it was important for me to underline this again, because it, for me, has been, I joined these processes last year when Think 7 for the first time was installed, and I must say, observing these and being allowed to contribute to these processes has been very insightful, similarly as what Tetsushi also mentioned. And we started this year in some of our conversations also in the interaction between Think 7 and Think 20 at a position where the differences actually were clearer or were a lot more visible than the convergences, the point of convergence. And I'm very happy to see that we could contribute to underlining and to focus on the convergences rather than on the differences. And I hope to do that again and again in the coming years. And I hope it can contribute to sustainable and long-term policy making. Thanks.
Thanks, Anna Caterina. And I think the fact that both you and Professor Sonobe are now part of these well-oiled or starting to be well-oiled mechanisms will also help in the future to make this engagement group closer and hopefully more and more effective in the dialogue with the policymakers. There is also a question on how mainstreaming gender in the next G7 presidency and how to make this reality. So I would also ask the speakers to elaborate on that, and it's a pity that you're leaving, Anna Caterina, because Germany has been one of the first countries to launch this feminist foreign policy, so it will be interesting to see if they will be followed by also the Italian government on this topic. But Valeria, what's your expectations for this summit, and also if you want to share some few points on mainstreaming gender in G7 action items? You can use this one.
Thanks, Daniele. The gender mainstreaming approach is key. As civil society organizations and as engagement group, we tried also during the G20 Italian presidency and all of these processes to make, to bring the relevance of adopting a gender mainstreaming approach. And we can see some results, actually, at least in terms of policies, in terms of commitments. Unfortunately, what we can see at ground level with our local communities, in our countries of operations, also here in Italy or in our offices and in our life, unfortunately, we can see a lot of inequalities, a lot of opportunity that we can, as women, we cannot take, we cannot have. So this is a kind of new political approach. This is a way to adopt, yes, a gender transformative approach, adopt a gender lens, facilitating gender mainstreaming policies, make some concrete, bold actions, for instance, against violence, gender violence, which is increasing, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that women and girls in all of their diversity are not the same, have not the same opportunities to have the education, to access to health services, to have a future, a prosperous future. So we would like to underline this approach, I'm sure that with the G7 countries and with the Italian government, we can move this agenda forward. But at the same time, we need to adopt this gender mainstreaming approach at global level. We need to change and adopt the gender mainstreaming in all of the policies. And in terms of the summit and the results we are expecting, I'd say that we expect bold initiatives from the Italian government, bold initiatives on debt relief, for instance, as I mentioned, because of the prolonged indebtedness. We expect bold initiatives in terms of food and nutrition security to reach the zero hunger goal. We have identified, the international community has identified in the 2030 agenda. Our expectation is that the Italian presidency, especially because of the link and the ambition to talk and tackle the migration flows, can make real, for instance, the human mobility right. So these are our expectations, and we are sure that we can bring our experience and we can facilitate and open the dialogue to make it real.
So, related to this gender equality, so I have a good news that all the engagement groups of under G7 now are going to issue the joint statement on the gender equality. So initially the W7 started, and then the person also the member of C7. So, and then I joined, I mean T7 joined, and all the other. I'm not 100% sure about the Urban 7, but they have no reason to refuse, so they will join. So it's a great move. And then I'm a development economist, so I'm really sure that gender equality, women and the girls' empowerment is a real key for the sustainable development and also development in the global south. And related to this joint statement, I forgot to say that when I emphasize the difference between T7 Japan and T20 India, what I really wanted to say was, despite such big difference, the T7 Japan and the T20 India are going to issue some joint statement, joint proposal, especially, as you can easily imagine, it's about the gender and also the debt crisis in the global south. Some are, lending countries, some are, borrowing countries, but they have to cooperate, of course. And then some aspects of climate issues, but not everything, but because of the lots of differences. But nonetheless, we can make a joint statement. And going back to the gender joint statement, it will be issued before the G7 gender ministers meeting, which will take place soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I think the ensuring that this that all the engagement groups have the same approach and are aligned on these particular topics that are uniting, not divisive, is really essential. So I think this is great news that you gave us. Director Lombardo, so what's your expectations about the new the summit in Paris, and if you also want to share for sure some of the activities that CDP is doing in mainstreaming also gender, for instance, in the field of finance.
With respect to Paris, I would just say two words. I'm not so sure whether expectation is the right term. It is my hope that there will be ambition and there will be innovation in setting up a new financial pact. We have a representative here from the Asian Development Bank, and we're working with them on an initiative that, from a financial engineering point of view, is highly innovative. I mentioned earlier billions, tens of billions, 100 billions. We're talking trillions of investments that are needed when instead we have limited fiscal space in most of our partner countries and high levels of debt. Unless we come up with innovative financing means and we leverage better the resources we have, including of the multilaterals, we're not actually going to tackle those issues seriously. So my hope is financial innovation and ambition. When it comes to supporting, addressing the gender issue, at CDP we have this this goal enshrined in our industrial plan. Let me just tell you that recently we've been investing only, for example, in our investment funds activity, with fund managers who put at the very heart of their investment policy sustaining and supporting female entrepreneurs. The last one that we supported, for example, has a minimum of investing its endowment up to 30%, minimum 30% of the investments relate to female entrepreneurship initiatives. But they move the bar higher, and they plan, once they acquire these companies, actually to transform these companies and actually improve the gender issue, and basically buy them at a particular level of female entrepreneurship and sell them with up to 70% of their portfolio, basically addressing the gender issue. So it is very dear to our hearts. We are part of the 2x initiatives, which is it's a global initiative that sees all the DFIs and development banks supporting this particular issue, and we're basically aligning to best practices in the field.
So this question was initially directed to you, and I think this you're a little bit under, the radars for this. But we know. Can you also tell us a list for what regards the Ministry of Finance? What are the key deliverables you are being involved or you might be working in light of this summit? We don't know yet if the Prime Minister will join. We know she's been invited by President Macron, so there was one question also about that. I don't think we can give an answer about who will be representing the country there, but we know for sure that the Prime Minister has been invited to that. But what are the key deliverables also in the working groups you have been involved on which you are supporting the government in light of this summit?
Yeah, I mean, despite my interest in focusing more on women's participation and empowerment, I understand that.
You should also reply on that.
Answer on the Paris Summit issues. I think relevant issues for the Paris Summit, starting from what we have seen participating in the preparatory process, will indeed be managing expectations, since the stakes are high, the bar has been raised more and more, but I think it will be also important to put this summit within existing processes that are already there, starting, of course, also from the G20, which has the topic of the global financial architecture as one of their main topics. looking more specifically at items that I think are a little bit more under control. So I would think it would be appropriate to start focusing on full implementation of some of the processes that are already there. So let me mention a few of them. So first of all, I think that in the landscape of financing, and specifically in the landscape of climate financing, we should not forget also what has been doing already with the rechanneling of special drawing rights, and where advanced countries have made their pledges to rechannel 20% of their SDR towards instruments like the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust or the Resilience Sustainability Trust, which is an instrument, new instrument, a new tool that the IMF has to accompany countries towards the green transition. And Italy has been rechanneling the full 20%, also adding the necessary part of coming from public finances of the related subsidies account, but many other countries are still not yet there. Even if the pledges are there, implementation is not there. So I think that first of all, a call to finalize this implementation would be relevant. Second, I would still capitalize on the experience of the Capital Adequacy Framework Review. As Paolo was mentioned, financial innovation is very relevant. Mobilization of the private sector towards this financial innovation will be key. Other aspects that are still ongoing are related to a better dialogue to credit rating agencies, so that if multilateral development banks are united in their dialogue, in their principles, in their benchmarks, in the dialogue that they can engage with credit rating agents, and if they can boost their specificities, starting, for example, from the preferred creditor status, there is more that can be gained in terms of potential leverage of financial activities. Another area that has not been fully explored so far is the area of vertical funds. There are several vertical funds devoted to climate, and there as well there could be a better leverage of the resources, and so that one could also better use resources for concessionality, since these funds have periodical replenishments with fresh resources from donors, and those resources may be possibly better used still with financial innovation and leverage. A final aspect that I would like to mention relates to the issues of debt distress. Of course, on the one hand, debt distress is increasing for several countries. On the other hand, the landscape of the stakeholders involved has changed significantly in the last years, and of course now involves very strong creditors like China. Private sector is much more involved, so that the instrument that is now to be used to address issues of debt distress is the common framework, which was born under the helm of the G20, which has some elements of timing, which is not ideal. It's taking a lot of time, but it's also time where there's a lot of mutual learning of the specific issues, and some progress is being made. Some initiatives could also be implemented around that, which could, for example, include principles on responsible sovereign lending, and also boost the ideas of climate resilience debt clauses that has been introduced in the debate starting from the private sector, but their application could also be extended to the official loans. So those are elements that I think could be quite concrete, and that could be part of the outcome of the summit. But of course, we will participate. On gender, what I can say is that all MDBs have gender mainstreaming in their, not only very high in their agenda, but really embedded in the activities. So at least from this side, there is already a lot of work that's been done, and that can be further boosted. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. It was a very dense discussion with a lot of insights from the Sherpa, from the experts. This is just the beginning of the debates. I would like to thank for the support provided to this project, Focus 2030, but also Compagnie San Paolo Foundation, who made this possible. I would also like to thank my colleagues Irene, Natalie, Ettore, who also made this possible with their work, and we will keep fostering the debate on this with analysis, with dissemination activities, and we really would like to engage with you more in the next few months. Italy will have, as we have heard, a key responsibility to play in the next few months within the G7, but also in coordination with the G20. And we as civil society, as research organizations, have a key responsibility to play in that regard as well. So I would like you to give a big round of applause to our speakers and panelists for their time today. Long work, long journey, difficult one, but we are confident that with a collective work and support, this will be possible. EIE is also generously providing some refreshments and drinks afterwards. Weather is not helping us, so we would have loved to be in the terrace, but there are some expectations of raindrops, so maybe it's better to stay inside. But we invite you kindly also to go outside to enjoy your drinks. Thanks so much for this, and we will keep informing you on the next steps of this project. Thanks a lot.